Among the Enoch fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran are physical remains showing that Enochic writings circulated in the Second Temple period, but those Aramaic fragments do not preserve the passage at the center of this mystery. That passage survives in the later Ethiopic tradition of First Enoch, where Enoch is carried into what the text calls the heaven of heavens. There he sees a structure like crystal, surrounded by living fire, and a throne guarded by beings named seraphim, cherubim, and Ophanim. The basic answer is startling but precise. First Enoch does not picture the heaven of heavens as empty. It describes a divine court. Yet three details complicate the picture. The throne vision in chapter 71 resembles an earlier vision in chapter 14, but the two scenes are not identical. The beings around the throne belong to ancient angelic vocabulary that later Jewish and Christian traditions would develop in different ways. And most importantly, the Qumran copies of Enoch discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls do not contain the section of First Enoch known as the Parables, where chapter 71 appears. So the investigation immediately divides in two. One question concerns what the text claims exists at the summit of heaven. Another concerns how securely that claim can be traced through surviving manuscripts. And the gap between those two questions is where the real mystery begins. That gap changes the entire question. That gap exists because First Enoch is not a single manuscript. It is a collection of Enochic works preserved through a complicated textual history. The earliest surviving witnesses are fragments from Qumran, written in Aramaic. Among them, 4Q2, 01, 4Q2, 024, Q20, 4Q205, 4Q206, 4Q207, and 4Q212 preserve portions of material now found within First Enoch. 4Q201 from Cave 4 is written on parchment in a Hasmonean period hand, while 4Q204 is classified paleographically as Herodian. These are copies, not the original compositions. Their importance is enormous. They demonstrate that substantial Enochic traditions existed in Aramaic centuries before the medieval Ethiopic manuscripts through which the complete work is known today. Greek fragments also survive, showing another stage of transmission, but no known Qumran manuscript preserves the section called the Parables, or Similitudes, corresponding to 1 Enoch 37 through 71. That absence must be handled carefully. It does not prove that the parables had not yet been composed, nor does it prove that Qumran readers rejected them. It means only that, among the Enochic manuscripts recovered there, no surviving fragment of that section has been identified. This matters because the title's most direct scene appears in 1 Enoch 71. The chapter reaches us through the Ethiopic textual tradition, not through a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. Its language, therefore, belongs to a transmission history different from the Aramaic pieces physically recovered beside the Dead Sea. And yet chapter 71 is not isolated. Its imagery belongs to a broader Enochic world of heavenly chambers, fiery architecture, angelic orders, and divine enthronement. The question is whether that world can be traced backward beyond the surviving Ethiopic wording. Earlier Enochic material preserved at Qumran contains its own ascent and throne imagery. That creates a crucial comparison which parts of the highest heaven vision are late, and which belong to an older core of the tradition. The older comparison begins in 1 Enoch 14 in the section commonly called the Book of the Watchers. Here the text does not yet speak in the same terms as chapter 71, but the architecture of the vision is unmistakable. Enoch is carried upward until he reaches a wall built of something like hailstones, with tongues of fire surrounding it. He enters a great house whose walls and floor appear crystalline, while fire moves through the structure. Then the scale changes. Beyond that first house, the text describes a second structure greater than the first. Its doorway stands open before Enoch, and inside he sees a throne whose appearance is compared with crystal, and whose wheels shine like the sun. Streams of fire pour out before it. Around the throne stand innumerable heavenly beings, while the great glory sits above them. The text states all of this as visionary description. It does not identify a measurable altitude, map a physical cosmos, or provide an astronomical model that can be tested like a modern diagram. What it gives instead is a hierarchy of sacred space. Enoch passes boundaries, enters increasingly restricted chambers, and approaches a presence so overwhelming that he falls on his face. Some scholars interpret this scene within the wider world of ancient Jewish throne visions, especially traditions associated with Ezekiel 1 and 10. The parallels are real at the level of imagery fire, wheels, living heavenly beings, radiance, and an enthroned divine figure. But similarity does not prove direct literary dependence in every detail. What matters for this investigation is the structure. Long before the surviving Ethiopic wording of chapter 71, Enochic tradition already imagined heaven as ordered in levels, guarded by supernatural beings, and culminating in a divine throne room beyond ordinary access. So when chapter 71 later speaks of the heaven of heavens, it is not inventing an entirely new kind of universe. It is intensifying an older pattern. But one question remains unresolved if the throne room is the summit. Who exactly are the beings permitted to stand closest to it? The answer becomes more specific in 1 Enoch 71. Around the fiery house, the text names three groups: seraphim, cherubim, and ophanim. They are described as beings who do not sleep and who guard the throne of divine glory. Beyond them stands an innumerable host, described through the familiar ancient formula of thousands upon thousands and myriads beyond counting. Then four names appear. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Phanuel are portrayed moving in and out of the heavenly house, accompanied by other holy angels. The text does not explain their bodies, dimensions, or exact positions in a rigid celestial hierarchy. It presents function and proximity. Some beings guard the throne, others surround the house. The four named angels have access to its interior. That distinction makes the scene stranger than a simple picture of angels in heaven. Seraphim and cherubim already have deep roots in biblical throne imagery. Isaiah 6 places seraphim around the divine throne, while Ezekiel connects cherubim with the divine chariot throne. The term ophanim, meaning wheels, recalls Ezekiel's mysterious wheels associated with the living creatures. In 1 Enoch 71, however, the three names appear together as attendants surrounding the throne. The text has gathered separate streams of sacred imagery into one celestial court. But the vision does not stop with its guardians. Enoch then sees the figure called the Head of Days, whose head is described as white and pure like wool. The imagery closely resembles the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, although resemblance alone cannot establish precisely how one text depended on another. What the surviving text shows is that the summit of Enoch's heaven is organized around presence-guarded boundaries, innumerable attendants, named heavenly figures, and finally, the enthroned source of authority. This is not a population list for a physical universe. It is a vision of cosmic order, expressed through the symbolic language of an ancient Jewish apocalypse. And once the Head of Days appears, the investigation shifts from who lives there to a more dangerous question: why is Enoch himself allowed so close? That question turns on one of the most disputed lines in the entire parables of Enoch. Near the end of chapter 71, after Enoch has entered the heavenly court, the figure identified as the Head of Days addresses him through an angelic interpreter. In the standard Ethiopic text, Enoch is told that he is the Son of Man who was born for righteousness, and that righteousness remains with him. This sounds, at first reading, like an astonishing identification. The visionary himself becomes the heavenly figure described earlier in the parables. But the small detail is the wording. The passage survives in Ge'ez manuscripts, and its interpretation has been debated because the grammatical construction can be read in more than one way. Some translations take the statement directly, as identifying Enoch with the Son of Man. Other scholars have argued that the wording may reflect a textual problem, a secondary development, or a difficult transmission history rather than the original form of the passage. The evidence does not allow us to solve that dispute simply by appealing to Qumran. No fragment of the parables has been recovered there, so there is no surviving Aramaic copy of chapter 71 against which the Ethiopic wording can be checked. That absence has a large implication. If the direct identification is original, then Enoch is not merely a visitor to the highest heavenly court. The text places him in a role of extraordinary status within that court. If the wording is secondary or has been altered in transmission, then the scene may have originally preserved a sharper distinction between Enoch and the exalted Son of Man figure. A single sentence therefore changes the architecture of the mystery. The question is no longer only who stands around the throne. It becomes whether Enoch himself is being transformed from witness into inhabitant. The strongest modern connection is not astronomy, it is textual criticism. Today, scholars can compare manuscript families, scripts, spellings, damaged readings, and translation layers to reconstruct how an ancient work changed as it moved from one language to another. With 1st Enoch, that work is unusually difficult because the textual chain is broken. Aramaic fragments survive from Qumran. Greek portions survive from antiquity. The complete book survives in Gaia's manuscripts copied much later. But the parables, including chapter 71, are not represented among the known Qumran Enoch fragments. That means the identification of Enoch with the Son of Man cannot be checked against an earlier Aramaic witness. Modern paleography helps date surviving fragments by comparing letter forms and scribal habits. Multispectral imaging can sometimes recover ink invisible to the naked eye on damaged manuscripts. Digital photography allows tiny fragments to be enlarged, compared, and virtually rearranged. None of these methods can manufacture missing text. They can clarify what survives, not restore a manuscript that has never been found, even when technology reveals additional letters. Interpretation still depends on language, context, and the physical joins between fragments. A clear image is not automatically a clear history. This limitation matters. If an Aramaic fragment of the parables were discovered with wording corresponding to 1st Enoch 71, it could transform the debate over how early that passage circulated and whether the Ethiopic form preserves an older reading. If it differed significantly, the same discovery could show that the text developed during transmission. But no such fragment is presently available. The modern tools, therefore, sharpen the question without answering it. They show how much confidence can be placed in physical evidence and where confidence has to stop. The scene of the highest heaven remains textually real within the Ethiopic tradition, but its earlier linguistic history is incomplete. That does not discredit the passage. It defines the limits of what can be demonstrated. And those limits create a new problem if the parables were transmitted differently from the Enochic works found at Qumran. Who preserved them? And why did this particular vision survive when so much of its earlier history disappeared? The answer is not that one community simply preserved Enoch while everyone else rejected it. The history is more fragmented than that. Fragments from Qumran show that Enochic literature circulated among Jews in the Second Temple period. But those manuscripts do not tell us that every Jewish group accepted the work as scripture. Later Rabbinic Judaism did not include 1st Enoch in the Hebrew Bible. By contrast, several early Christian writers knew Enochic traditions, and the New Testament letter of Jude contains a passage closely corresponding to 1st Enoch 1:9. That proves literary contact with Enochic material. It does not prove that every early Christian community treated the entire book as canonical. The transmission record then narrows. Greek copies of portions of 1st Enoch survived, and Latin preserves limited material, but the complete work did not remain part of the biblical canon in most Christian traditions. Ethiopian Christianity followed a different path. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, 1st Enoch was preserved in Ge'ez and remained within a broader scriptural canon. That preservation is the reason the full text, including the parables in chapter 71, is available today. This history is sometimes described as suppression. The evidence is more cautious. Texts can disappear because languages change, manuscript copying declines, libraries are lost, or communities favor different collections. There is no reliable evidence that the Council of Nicaea removed 1st Enoch from the Bible, and no single documented decree explains its disappearance from most Western manuscript traditions. The conflict is therefore not a secret decision. It is a divergence of reception. One tradition preserved the whole book. Other traditions preserve quotations, fragments, echoes, or nothing at all. Modern scholars then inherited a text whose different sections have different manuscript histories and different levels of external attestation. That matters for the highest heaven vision. The passage survived because the Ethiopic tradition carried it forward, but we still do not know how widely that specific scene circulated in earlier centuries. So the central historical question remains open: was chapter 71 once known far beyond Ethiopia? Or are we looking at a vision whose earlier audience has almost completely vanished from the record? That missing audience leaves one physical problem at the center of the investigation. Archaeologists recovered multiple Aramaic manuscripts representing other parts of 1st Enoch from Qumran. Yet no securely identified copy of the parables has emerged from the caves. The absence remains one reason the date and early history of 1st Enoch, 37 through 71, continue to be debated. The silence is important, but it cannot carry more weight than the evidence allows. A library can preserve many copies of one work and none of another. Manuscripts decay, caves are disturbed, ancient collections are incomplete. So the failure to find the parables at Qumran does not demonstrate that the work did not exist during the period when the site's manuscripts were being collected. It establishes only that no recognized fragment has survived there. And that creates an unusual imbalance. For the Book of the Watchers, physical Aramaic fragments allow modern scholars to compare the later Ethiopic text against manuscripts more than a millennium older. For the highest heaven scene in chapter 71, that bridge disappears. We possess the vision, but not its early Aramaic footprint. The dating question, therefore, becomes inseparable from the theological one. Some scholarship places the parables within a Jewish setting around the turn of the era, while proposals about its precise date remain contested. If an early witness were ever identified, even a small fragment containing distinctive language from chapters 70 or 71 could clarify when this extraordinary portrayal of Enoch circulated. Until then, the most dramatic part of the title rests on a paradox. The ancient work describes the highest heavenly court with remarkable confidence. Yet the surviving physical record becomes weakest precisely where that description reaches its climax. So how far can the evidence actually take us before the manuscript record ends and interpretation begins? Now, an important distinction is necessary. The physical evidence proves that Enochic writings circulated in antiquity. Aramaic fragments from Qumran preserve portions of 1st Enoch centuries earlier than the complete Ethiopic manuscripts. But those fragments do not preserve the parables, and they do not preserve chapter 71. The textual evidence is different. The surviving Ethiopic tradition does contain chapter 71. It describes Enoch entering an exalted heavenly realm, seeing the head of days, encountering innumerable heavenly beings, and hearing language that has been understood as identifying him with the Son of Man. That is what the text states. It does not prove that such a realm exists as a physical location. It does not prove that seraphim, cherubim, Ophanim, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, or Phanuel are observable inhabitants of a measurable universe. Archaeology has recovered manuscripts, not heaven. Interpretation begins when we ask what the imagery meant to its ancient audience. The throne, fire, angelic attendants, and layered sacred space belong to a broader world of Jewish apocalyptic literature. Scholars can compare those images with Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and other Second Temple traditions. But comparison cannot tell us with certainty how every element originated, or how literally ancient readers understood it. Speculation begins beyond that boundary. If the Ethiopic form of chapter 71 preserves an early version of the passage, and if the disputed Son of Man wording truly identifies Enoch, rather than reflecting a later textual development, then the larger question becomes whether this tradition imagined a human visionary crossing the final boundary between mortal observer and permanent member of the heavenly court. That would make the highest heaven more than a destination Enoch briefly visits. It would make it a place into which he is incorporated. But even that conclusion remains conditional. The strongest evidence does not reveal the geography of the universe. It reveals something historically more secure. Ancient authors transmitted a detailed vision of a structured heavenly court, populated by distinct classes of beings, centered on divine authority, and accessible to Enoch in a way few other human figures are portrayed as experiencing. and precisely where that claim reaches its greatest intensity. The early manuscript trail breaks. So one final question remains. What does the surviving artifact allow us to say when the vision itself goes farther than the evidence can follow? Return to Cave 4 at Qumran, where scraps of parchment still preserve portions of Enochic literature in Aramaic. They are damaged, incomplete, and silent about chapter 71. Yet their existence fixes one part of the story in the physical world. Enochic texts were copied, handled, stored, and left behind by ancient people. The highest heaven vision survives elsewhere, through the Ethiopic tradition that preserved the complete book. In that text, the summit of heaven is not empty. It is a guarded court of fire and radiance, attended by seraphim, cherubim, ophanim, named archangels, innumerable heavenly beings, and the enthroned head of days. That is the literary claim. The manuscripts prove the text survived, not that the vision describes a place archaeology can reach. And so the investigation ends where it began, with fragments that can be touched and a vision that cannot. The parchment from Qumran tells us that Enochic tradition is ancient. The Ethiopic manuscripts tell us what one branch of that tradition preserved. Between them lies a missing textual bridge, especially where the account reaches its highest heaven. The physical evidence remains. But if an early Aramaic witness to chapter 71 were discovered, would it confirm that this vision belonged to the oldest recoverable form of the tradition,